So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to Soda. We've just watched your fantastic film, so congratulations again on a brilliant piece of work. So for the benefit of the people here, I'm going to start with an introduction. So James Jones is an award-winning British director who makes documentary films for international television and theatrical release. He has just finished a feature documentary, Antidote, at Passion Pictures. He is represented by WME. His documentaries tell extraordinary human stories from all over the world. The films combine journalistic rigour with a distinctive cinematic sensibility. They have played at some of the world's leading film festivals and screened on Netflix, Apple TV, HBO, PBS, Sky and the BBC. His film on the drug war in the Philippines, On the President's Orders for Frontline PBS, Arte France, BBC Storyville and Bertha Doc Society was described by Variety as, quote, a wholly cinematic sensory experience. James has a long-standing interest in Russia and speaks fluent Russian. His BAFTA-winning film, Chernobyl, The Lost Tapes, described as a tense, chilling, powerful by the New York Times and mind-blowing by the Times, is streaming on HBO Max. His Apple TV series Wanted, The Escape of Carlos Ghosn, was described by Rolling Stone as blending high-stakes shoe leather reporting with thriller sizzle. His film Antidote won an award at Tribeca Film Festival 2024, and Variety wrote, from its very first moments, Antidote unspools like a propulsive thriller, a rousing feature-length call to action. His films have won 2 Emmys, 3 DuPonts, 3 Royal Television Society Awards, a Grierson, a BAFTA, a Rory Peck, a Frontline Club, a Broadcast Award, a Cinema Eye Honours Award, 2 Overseas Press Club of America, 2 Golden Nymphs, Best UK Feature at Raindance and a Venice TV Award, as well as being nominated 7 times at the BAFTAs. So James, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much for agreeing to take part and also for the screening of your film.
Well, thank you.
My first question, as stated in your biography, you have a long interest in Russia and speak fluent Russian. Can you talk about that interest, how it relates to your interest in Ukraine and Chernobyl, and how this film came about?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for screening the film. It's lovely to be talking to you and have people watch it again. It's a film that meant a lot to us. So I studied Russian. I lived in Russia when I was at university, speak Russian, and I think like lots of people who study Russian, you kind of become obsessed with it. Like it's not something you do in like half measures. And then when I started working in like journalism and filmmaking, I really just like fell out of love with Russia because of the state the country was in and because Putin was leading, and I just like almost had an allergy to it for quite a long time. And then I remember in 2014, I was finishing off a film about Syria, and then I was actually in America at the time, and every day on the front page of the New York Times, they had these incredible photographs of the protesters in Kiev on Maidan, like, you know, minus 20 degrees, people like fighting against the police, you know, basically standing up for independence from Russia. And for the first time in years, I just like grabbed the camera and booked a flight to Kiev and showed up and thought like, oh, I speak Russian, I can get by. And actually turned out my Russian was terrible because I hadn't spoken it for 10 years, you know, and it was a struggle in that way. But what was amazing is the people there were so kind of idealistic and motivated by the idealism of this revolution and standing up for a like progressive, open future for Ukraine, that people would like drive me around. You know, like it's the opposite of some countries you go to where everyone's trying to get money off you. Like no one would take money. It was this kind of extraordinary experience for a few weeks around the time when the president fled to Russia. And it was, you know, really moving and kind of felt amazing to be a part of that moment of history. And then I went to the East as well, where basically Putin was causing trouble. He couldn't allow the revolution to be seen as a success. Otherwise, all the neighboring countries around Russia would get the same idea. So he sent in like Russian thugs to cause trouble in Donetsk and, you know, the areas in the east that are more Russian speaking and more people watch Russian TV. And, you know, I saw this kind of like almost like ghoulish parody of what I'd seen in Kiev, which was like so idealistic and full of hope. And it was kind of drunken and just violent and unpleasant. And so that kind of reignited my interest in the region and I guess, you know, my love for Kiev and Ukraine. And then this film came about. People had, you know, I'd always been interested in Chernobyl and people had told me about a couple of books I needed to read on the subject. And then during COVID, like the first lockdown that spring when we were all at home, I think partly because I was interested in like the cover up in China around COVID and doctors wanting to speak out but being silenced, and that somehow like resonated with Chernobyl and also this kind of invisible enemy and, you know, totalitarian states dealing with it. And I read a couple of books by one Ukrainian author and someone else, and just came across in the footnotes reference to the footage you've just seen in the film where people are walking around that first weekend after the accident and you see like white flashes on the film because the radiation levels are so high. And, you know, there's kids playing in the sand, there's people getting married, there's people just going about their day. And like the horror of that situation of people just totally oblivious because their government isn't being honest with them. And I basically thought, like, if that was filmed, like, I wonder what else is out there. And so then just went down a rabbit hole of trying to find like every bit of footage that exists and was shot around the accident.
Thank you. This leads me perfectly to my next question. So the archival work in the project is absolutely extraordinary. Can you talk a bit about what you did to get hold of that material, how and where you found it, and what were the processes that you went through to collate and collect and then edit the footage together?
Yeah, it's funny because the title, which we decided on quite late, The Lost Tapes, makes it sound almost like, oh, we stumbled across a box of the lost tapes under someone's bed and it was like, oh, here they are, they're not lost. Whereas actually, like, as you know, we all know, the reality of life is that it's much more painstaking and laborious and actually just takes a long time. And it's about just methodically contacting every single person who either lived in Pripyat, the nearest town, or anyone who might have filmed the rescue operations, you know, the clear up operations, or, you know, scientists, whatever. And so it became this big kind of almost like detective puzzle, and, you know, it lasted like more than a year. And it was, I mean, I have to say I loved it. It was like, it felt just like a very pure process of, you know, often when you're making a film, a lot of your time is dealing with kind of logistics and film crew and, you know, all the stuff that comes with making it. Whereas with this, it was just me and my microphone, my Ukrainian colleague, and we were, you know, it was a combination of going to state archives in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine. Also, we had a brilliant Russian colleague, Sasha, and she went to some of the Russian state archives as well to see what they had, because obviously, even though a lot of the people who filmed were Ukrainian, some of the footage was still owned by, you know, because it was the Soviet Union, some were still owned by Moscow. So it's a kind of complicated process, particularly as, you know, Russia was sanctioned even at that point before the, you know, the full scale invasion. And then some of it was more kind of contacting people whose granddad filmed, and they said, oh yeah, we've got these rolls of film under our bed that we've never showed to anyone. So you'd have these moments of amazing breakthroughs. And actually, weirdly, one of the most amazing breakthroughs was someone who is a cinematographer, like a well-known cinematographer in Ukraine, films, dramas, is now actually has been promoted to being head of the like Ukrainian Union of Cinematographers. And he came to my hotel room, met us. He had this footage that he basically never showed to anyone, which is like crazy given that he's in that world. You know, it's not someone who filmed something and then just like wasn't in that kind of professional space, so didn't know what to do with it. But I think it was because it was so emotional for him, and it was such a kind of formative experience. You know, he was very young when he filmed it, and it was, you know, he's an incredibly talented cinematographer, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's shot on film, and it looks like a movie. There's no sound on it, and so I think he was kind of conflicted because he had this great footage, but it wasn't kind of enough on its own to make a film, and it had no sound, and so he just kind of sat on it for all these, you know, 35 years. And then we watched it, and I was honestly, my jaw was on the floor. And then it was like a long process of actually, you know, a few meetings and some very long, flowery emails between him and me, as if we were kind of like 19th century diplomats. It was quite strange. And then eventually, you know, I think he watched some of my other documentaries, and we just had a bond of trust, and he agreed to let us use his footage. So and then sometimes it was, you know, you'd find like a documentary that was shot about the effects, a kind of educational documentary shot about the effects of radiation, and that was some of the footage of the you know, liquidators who were, you know, whose bodies were incredibly severely affected by it. So it was really like a mosaic of different sources, and I guess like the challenge then is to like find the human stories within this kind of like swirling mosaic to make it feel unified. And I think from the very beginning of pitching the film, I was always really keen both that it was like entirely archived, so you were just like immersed in that moment. Like I didn't want it to feel like a British documentary team making a film in 2022. I wanted it to feel like you were in 1986 in Soviet Union, in Ukraine, and you were kind of through the looking glass, and everything was in that space. And also I wanted it to go from like pre-accident, like utopia, through the accident, through the clear up, and then all the way to the kind of anger and protest, and then the collapse of Soviet Union. And I think a lot of the kind of TV commissioners were a bit like, that sounds impossible. Like it's just too ambitious to do something so epic and sweeping when you're not even seeing an interviewee on camera. Like, how can you? And for me, it was just obvious because the protest and anger were like an emotional reaction to what the viewer's seeing as well. So you're totally with them. You're like furious at the lies and the suffering that's been caused. And so then it's like totally like cathartic when you see people rising up against the Soviet Union. So for me, there was always like a logic to it, but I could see people looking at me thinking like, that's not going to work, you know. And actually, hopefully it does. And by staying like immersed in the footage, you kind of, you're kind of the protest and everything makes sense on an emotional level as well as, you know, like a historical retelling of it.
Thank you. That's hearing you talk about it makes it even more remarkable. It's almost another story alongside the film, the collection of the materials. So the human side of it, this relates to my next question. So one of my favourite books about Chernobyl is Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. So your work, like Alexievich's, makes use of remarkable testimony and interviews. So my question is, have you read Alexievich's work? If so, did it inspire you? Can you talk more about the interviews you recorded, and in particular your interview with Lyudmila Ignatenko?
Yeah, I definitely have read Svetlana Alexievich's book, and it's brilliant, and she's a fantastic writer. And Lyudmila obviously appears in her book, and also appears in the HBO drama, or HBO and Sky drama series. But interestingly, when we started making this, you know, she'd kind of been, I think the makers of the drama had got in touch with her, but she, you know, she's a kind of a woman who has nothing to do with the media, is, you know, incredibly lovely and warm and great, but like like lots of people of that generation, quite suspicious, I would say. And so when someone calls them up and says, "Oh, we're from an American production company, we're making a drama about your life," she's kind of like, just didn't want to engage really. And then suddenly her story and, her trauma really is like all over the world. And so when we started, I didn't think there was really a chance that she would agree to be part of the film, just because she hadn't signed up to suddenly having to be so public about it all again. But again, we met her, and I think the fact that I could speak to her in Russian, although she now prefers to speak Ukrainian, definitely. She liked the idea that we were using people's voices and real footage. I think that kind of resonated with her as a way to ensure that she had ownership over it. And it unlike even Svetlana's Alexievich's book, it was her telling her story and then someone else using it. And with the drama, certainly she had no say in that at all. So I think that made sense to her on some level. And then we just had a warm, I'm probably roughly the same age as her son, and we kind of, we had a good bond. And also probably the fact that it's just audio, the interviews, it means people are a bit more relaxed. They're not, their guard isn't up. They can just kind of forget that you're recording. So yeah, I'm trying to think how long. Actually, I remember we lined up the interview with her, and I'd gone to Kiev, and then I don't know if you remember, it wasn't Omicron, but there was some COVID variant that had originated in the UK, and suddenly that was over all the news. So she understandably didn't want to meet me coming from the UK. So she cancelled the first time, and then I went the next time, and we did it, and she was just fantastic. She's so kind of wise and has suffered so much. And yeah, I was incredibly honoured and grateful that she told us her story. And it, and we can talk later about what she's been through since we made the film. But yeah, that was a big part. That was a big moment for me, I guess, because I knew that her story was so powerful and so human, and she embodied the kind of optimism of the town before the accident, and she really believed in that kind of utopian view of the place. So yeah, she was fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. A really brilliant and very powerful perspective on the film and the narrative. So returning to the footage itself, some of the footage in the film is startling in how graphic it is, and other parts are startling, as you've referred to, in how ordinary some of the events were. So there's this sort of silent, invisible killer of radiation. So it's completely invisible as people went away about their day-to-day lives. So what kinds of decisions were you making about how and what to include, how to tell the story of something that is essentially invisible to the human eye?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in terms of how graphic and gory, it was there was definitely even worse stuff than we showed. And I think we never wanted it to be kind of off-putting. We didn't want to kind of shock people for shock's sake. But equally, we wanted to give people a sense of what these men had gone through. And so, yeah, when I think it's when she's narrating her husband's physical condition deteriorate, we did show it, and it, probably seen in isolation, it is graphic and it is hard to look at, but it felt like it was supporting her story and her suffering, and it wasn't gratuitous. It was kind of in service of the emotion and the power of her story. And then in terms of kind of conveying the fear and the kind of danger they were in, that was kind of a big job for editing. The editor that I worked with, who's a genius, the sound team I worked with, just making, again, because it was different, like a patchwork or whatever the phrase is, of different bits of footage, kind of making that all feel coherent and kind of, yeah, I guess using the audio particularly, I think, to convey just the atmosphere, the kind of otherworldliness of the things that they were doing, and yeah, kind of nightmarishness of it really, I think was really important. And then yeah, so I think that was kind of that was what was so nice about the film, is that like the process, like I said before, it felt very pure. It was like, gather the footage from as many different places as we can find it, and then, you know, interview these people. Because it's audio, I could go back and interview them again, and it was a kind of ongoing, you know, I think I actually need a bit more about this bit or whatever, and that's quite nice, because usually in TV, once you filmed it, like that's your one shot really, and then just like crafting it in the edit, and you have to make kind of difficult choices. So like, where normally when you film someone on camera, like we had an interview with a firefighter who was like one of the first people to get onto the roof when it was like, and he put out the fire, and it's an incredible story, and you're like, how is this guy still alive? But because we'd made the choice to not show interviews and just stick with footage, and there was no footage of this moment, and you can't really, you know, like in some instances with the film, you know, you can kind of use things laterally or artfully, but like with a moment like that, you can't fake it, you know, and there was no footage of it. So you just have to kind of make a choice that like, okay, we can't use that guy's story. And that, I think, you know, even though it's like frustrating at the time, because you're like, oh God, we've done this extraordinary interview, it's just not usable. But I think it gives the film a kind of clarity that like, when you're in it, you are looking at the footage of that moment, you know, and you're not having to rely on other devices. So I think even though it's like frustrating to have to cast things aside, I think that in a way gave the film some of its strength, because you just have to like really embrace what you do have.
Wow, that's a real insight into the filmmaking process, taking out material of that sort of strength, and like you say, to give substance to the whole. Okay, so my next question is really two questions in one. So it's about language. So the use of the use of language in the film is also important. So on one hand, there's the language of the state in Russian, and then in other places, the voices of individuals who speak both Ukrainian and Russian. So did you consider this, and as you're making the film, and as a broader question, what significance does this and your work as a whole now take on following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, language in Ukraine is a thorny issue. You know, there's, as Russia says, you know, in the east of the country, most people are Russian speaking. In the center and the west, most people are Ukrainian speaking, but most Ukrainians can speak both. And throughout Ukrainian history, Russia has tried to kill the Ukrainian language. So it was always a kind of loaded question, whether people would want to do interviews in Russian or Ukrainian. And I was always determined not, even though for me it would be easier if everyone spoke Russian because I speak Russian, I was always determined, and my Ukrainian colleague was determined, to just give people the choice to speak whichever they want. And probably in the end it was about 50-50, I think. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the ones who speak Russian are more pro-Russian or anything like that. It just so happens that they grew up in an area or a family where they speak Russian. And yeah, obviously the state propaganda is all Russian. And then some of the clips of like the amazing old women who live on the farm with the kind of, you know, mutated pigs and who are just like wonderful. I'm not really sure what they're speaking. It's like a weird dialect, that bit of Ukrainian, bit of Russian. But I would say if we made the film again now, because basically we finished the film the week the full-scale invasion happened. If we were making the film again now, it would, I think almost everyone would speak Ukrainian. I think maybe a couple of the older guys might still speak Russian. But it's become even more of a. I mean, my friends in Kiev, who most of whom spoke Russian, refuse to speak Russian with me now, and they hate it. And they get annoyed with me if I post anything in Russian, or which I totally understand. So yeah, I think I'm glad. Lyudmila definitely spoke Ukrainian, although interestingly, in the footage when she goes back to her apartment, which was shot a few years ago, so before the revolution and stuff, she was speaking Russian. And now, interestingly, her Russian's like not fluent anymore. So she's so become a kind of proud Ukrainian. And, so I think like as a country, Ukraine is just, I think when an empire or a larger neighboring state tries to crush your culture and take over your country, you become more aware of hanging on to things like language and culture. So, I'm very happy that Ukraine, and actually there was a terrible thing when it played on HBO that like some of the, not the subtitles, but the captions, and I wasn't involved in that, but the first night it went out, some people messaged me and said that a caption said like speaking Russian, and they were speaking Ukrainian. I was like, you can't mislabel Ukrainian as Russian. This is like really against the spirit of it. So so it's a massively thorny issue, and I think like I say, if we did it again today, the ratio would be even more Ukrainian versus Russian.
Yeah, I agree, and it is really fascinating, and it is loaded in a way that it didn't used to be, and it does represent a lot to people. So in the film, sort of towards the end of the film, you make a direct connection for Chernobyl as a direct factor in the breakdown of the former USSR in 1991. Was this an easy conclusion to come to, and did your ideas about the fall of the Soviet Union change during production?
So I read like a lot about Chernobyl in those early months, and there was one book written by this Ukrainian. She was a journalist in an area near Chernobyl, Zhytomyr, and then she became a politician. And I read about this moment, and we kind of tried to use it in the film. It didn't quite work. She also didn't want to be involved in the film, but she wrote this book, and actually, she tells a story of standing up when they first had the basically like the kind of parliament, and she stood up and she handed Gorbachev a tape of one of the documentaries that was shot involving those women on the farm and that kind of thing, documenting the kind of effects of radiation on people and animals in that area. And I was just like, wow, what a kind of inspiring thing to do. And like for a documentary maker to hear about documentary being part of this kind of protest movement was kind of amazing. And in the end, the footage of her doing it is like just doesn't really capture it, and she because she didn't want to be involved, we ended up not kind of going too deep in that. But her book and others were like really good accounts of. There's a Ukrainian historian called Serhiy Plokhy, and he, great historian, and writes, wrote a great book on Chernobyl. I've got another one of his books here. They documented how, no one would argue that Chernobyl was like the main or the only cause of this collapse of the Soviet Union. But what it did was, A, made people angry, but B, gave people cover in a world that was like at least pretending to open up a bit, so they could organize protests under the guise of being like environmental or to do with the consequence of Chernobyl, which was kind of tolerated. And it became a way to have these big protests that were more pro-Ukrainian independence, pro the end of the Soviet Union, and became a kind of protest movement but by another name. And the leaders of that group became the kind of political leaders of this movement. And like, I guess we, and again with the film, you don't want to get too bogged down in the kind of intricacies of Ukrainian politics in that period, but you understand it emotionally, that these people were angry and they were finally allowed to kind of hit the streets. And so I think, people in Ukraine for a long time had been aware that Moscow was a source of lots of their problems and treated them as second-class citizens and saw them as expendable. So, and that was happening in other republics for other reasons as well. But I think it was, along with the war in Afghanistan, along with the, collapsing economy, but it was definitely a catalyst for it. And so for me to tell that story in one sweep was always the ambition. And then we kind of began and ended the film with Swan Lake to show the kind of cyclical nature of Soviet power. And it felt important. And I guess even though the full-scale invasion hadn't happened at that point, it, having been in Ukraine since the invasion in 2014, it felt like it resonated. It was a kind of Moscow's lies, kind of sacrificing their own people and Ukraine's people, and then the kind of bravery of Ukrainians, one way or another, to stand up to that, that brought about independence, which Putin was then trying to reverse again. So yeah, it had a resonance even before the full-scale invasion. Then it became, even more intense, I guess.
Thank you. So you're still working in and with Ukraine and Ukrainian subjects. So can you talk about the projects that you're working on now, the film that you've just completed, for example, and any other new projects that you currently have in production?
So I've just finished a film called Antidote, which is a feature documentary basically about Russian state murder, so of Russian opposition people, but also foreign journalists and other people. And the starting point was actually about, we had a whistleblower from inside Russia's poison program, so who'd been developing Novichok, which was used to poison Alexei Navalny and other people. And we were working closely with Bellingcat and an investigative journalist called Christo Grozev. And halfway through filming, Christo discovers that, he's the man who's exposed more Russian spies and assassins than anyone, from the Skripals to Navalny to many other people. And he discovers halfway through filming that he is the target of a plot himself, and so has to go on the run. So we kind of film that as it plays out, as they discover that this spy ring has been following him around the world for like 3 years. And then we also follow the case of a man called Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the most principled Russian opposition figure, who was poisoned twice by, this same group of people, and was then locked up for treason in April 2022 for speaking out against the war in Ukraine, and we filmed his kind of sham trial, and he was eventually sentenced to 25 years, basically in a gulag. So we filmed with his wife and kids, who now live in America. And I guess the title Antidote is a reference to the poison program, obviously, but I guess also the slightly optimistic hope that journalists like Christo or activists like Vladimir Kara-Murza can be a kind of antidote to the poison of Putin and Putin's Russia. So it's I think when we started as well, I was quite clear that it would feel like a kind of modern version of the Chernobyl film, like very different in some ways, but this idea that a regime can collapse under the weight of its own lies, the war and sending hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths, committing war crimes, not even allowing people to talk, to say the word war, like that's not sustainable forever. And Russians have kind of let him get away with it because living standards were improving, and now that's not the case anymore. I think he is living on borrowed time. And it's an interesting subject in relation to Ukraine, because some of my Ukrainian friends, lots of my Ukrainian friends would say, forget about the Russian opposition, all Russians are the same. But I think, and I think there are Russian opposition leaders who aren't ideal, aren't perfect. But I think someone like Vladimir Kara-Murza, for instance, who's spoken out against the invasion of Ukraine for going back a decade, has tried to get people involved in it, sanctioned around the world, has been an advocate for a different Russia. I think if people like him can take over Russia one day, that's not to say that the country isn't rotten in many ways, but that is better for the world, better for Ukraine. And I think it's not to diminish Ukraine's suffering at the hands of Russia to focus on some of these people. And what's been nice actually is that I have showed it to some Ukrainian friends and Ukrainians that I didn't know, and they reacted really positively to the film. So that was a relief.
Thank you. That's a fantastic insight into your forthcoming work. I'm very much looking forward to seeing this. So yeah, thank you for the preview in the background. Okay, my final question. So is there anything we haven't covered that you consider to be important in how people understand the work that we've seen, or that you want people to take away from it?
I think we've covered everything. They're all good questions. I think the fact that it came out the week the war started was, it felt like a sick joke almost, that we had worked to make this film that had all these historical parallels, and then to suddenly be getting voice notes from people in the film saying they're in a basement and bombs are dropping around them. It was horrific. And, in some ways made the film feel more urgent and important, but also made me feel uncomfortable, because it was like, why am I releasing a film about this when a war is happening? So it led to a lot of kind of conflicting emotions. But so I guess the main point is that the themes of the film are kind of timeless as well, even though at that particular moment they felt very resonant.
Okay, so I'm going to conclude then by just thanking you once again for your time, for agreeing to show the work, and for the fabulous insights into the work that you've made and your current and future projects as well. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.